Whether you're looking for relationship advice or
And so tonight we're going to wrap up. Actually, today is the last day of April, so we're going to wrap up that conversation, or that series rather, and talk tonight about sexual assault and mental health. As usual, before we jump straight into the conversation, I give you all some time to gather your troops, to let everybody know that Pleasure Pulse is on and live, to take a breather, whatever you need. But we'll take a short break and then we'll come right back. And we're back. That was a very, very short break, so you probably just took a little spin. You were like, oh man, they're back already. Yeah, very quick turn, quickie, if you will. So tonight we're going to continue the conversation focused on sexual assault, and I'm very excited to have my guest here this evening join me again. She's been here before, and we're going to talk tonight about sexual assault and mental health, so the connection between those two topics. Before I jump right in, I'll ask my guest to introduce herself.
Good evening to everyone. My name is Andrea Wattley, mental health counselor from 3C's Counseling Services.
Welcome.
Yes, thank you for having me again.
Thank you for agreeing again to be here. So tonight, and our past conversations, and let me just remind you all of some of the things that we've discussed. So last week we had some folks from the Department of Gender Affairs, as well as the department that deals with child probation, child protection, and so on. And the previous week we had two of those same guests plus Dr. Patrick Martin, but specifically when it comes to mental health support and the mental health impact of sexual violence. So I imagine, actually I'm not even sure, and I would encourage my listeners to take some time to think yourself about what you think the connection is between mental health and sexual assault or sexual violence, because you might not have even thought about that connection. I think for sure survivors and the immediate family, the immediate support system of survivors think about it or have it more forefront in their minds, but it might not necessarily be something that the rest of us consider when we're talking about sexual assault. So can you first explain to folks how sexual assault can lead to psychological trauma?
Okay, so when we speak about sexual assault, we speak about violation. And that violation, then, it's like taking away value from that person. And so you recognize that just like physical abuse, a person who is physical abuse, it does have an impact on them and how they value themselves. It's very similar to sexual assault. So from sexual assault, we get what we call sexual trauma. So from that sexual trauma, which is a long list of effects that it affects you psychologically. It can be from anxiety and depression to post-traumatic stress disorder. It can lead to substance abuse and even to some physical effects from that sexual trauma. So it's a whole long list of things to be mindful of when we speak to sexual assault. So it doesn't just end with the deed and the physical impact to the person, but it has very long-term and a lifelong impact on that person mentally.
So can you tell us, you gave us some examples, right? Some of the potential mental health complications, mental health issues that might arise having experienced sexual trauma. So can you break them down into like what's immediate and maybe
Okay.
what is more long term?
Okay. So initially, someone who would have experienced a sexual assault, the result would be sexual trauma. So that's what we refer to it as, sexual trauma. Now, how that person responds to it varies from person to person. But the first initial stage is usually shock. So that person may be like, hey, did this really happen? Like, they're still assessing the situation. They become like very unaware. This is unreal to me. Like, I can't believe that this happened to me. So that's the first initial response. So you will recognize that someone who would have been experiencing sexual abuse or sexually assaulted, or even as a child being molested, they tend to be like the moment for them. And then after that, they go into denial, like, this can't be for real, this didn't happen to me. And what that denial does is that it sets them somewhat in a recovery mode to take them away from the actual act. So that is where they begin to suppress the actual act, the thoughts, the responses that are so natural to the action, that they begin to suppress it because they don't know how to deal with it. So after the initial shock, I can't believe this happened to me, then the next one is denial. No, this didn't happen to me. And with that denial, there's a lot of guilt and there's a lot of shame that is attached to it. Person begin to question their value, like, am I not worthy? How did I deserve this? So after that recovery, that's the recovery, that's that suppressive state, which is usually a very long time. Because even now when we look at some things that are happening in the media, and we see adults coming forward and saying, hey, this happened to me and now I'm seeking justice, they are actually at the fourth stage. And that's the fourth stage of really post-traumatic stress disorder, where the first stage where they were in shock, the second stage they were suppressing it, they were in denial. Then there was a third stage where they actually came to grips with what happened to them. So they're able to verbalize it. They're able to recap and say, hey, this is what happened, XYZ. And then the fourth stage is where you actually begin to seek justice because you recognize it wasn't my fault. I wasn't deserving of this. So you see the pattern, and each stage is a different stage. Each person responds to these stages differently, but from the outside looking in, persons tend to say, well, at the beginning your story changed. You said this earlier, but now you're saying this now. And those would be the stages of going through that trauma.
While you were speaking, I was listening and thinking about, it caused me to think about, well, triggers too, because I think sometimes, and I've said, like, as a chronically online person too, it's like sometimes an unrelated as well as related thing might cause those memories to come back for folks. So sometimes it's something that they smell, or sometimes it's something that they see or hear. It's it's a voice that sounds familiar, right? And I was also thinking about, you know, the question that people sometimes ask survivors is like, why it took you so long to come and say something where you didn't talk before, along with, you know, your story change and whatever. So I was thinking about, you know, those stages and the need for the communities around survivors to understand those stages. And provide that support as well. To let people to come out when they're ready.
Correct. And as you said, you were highlighting the different ways that you can begin to get those triggers, and it's because our five senses would have absorbed. And whenever we go through a traumatic experience, we hear, we see, we smell, we feel. So our senses are absorbing all that information, and it's being registered in our brains. So although we might not take notice that a bell was ringing while I was being assaulted, it was registered. So then later on, even a couple years after, you hear that bell, and that's a trigger. Hey, it carried me right back to that time. And so that is why when persons begin to tell their story, people will say, well, how come you didn't say that then? And it's because during the second stage, when you were trying to suppress and trying to retreat really to build up yourself, all that information was still there. And so that is why sometimes it's important to give persons time to breathe, time to really, be conscious and self-aware of everything that took place before they can actually really share and understand that even in time to come, you may get even new information.
Okay. And you mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder earlier. How common is that? And I think you could, actually the last time you were here, we were talking about postpartum depression. And so, I think about the connections between sexual assault, postpartum depression, and all of those things. But let's talk about how prevalent post-traumatic stress disorder is among survivors of sexual violence, and what some of the symptoms are that might not be so obvious to friends and family.
Okay, so post-traumatic stress disorder, sometimes people use it very loosely, not recognizing that this term was mostly associated with persons who went and fought war.
Yeah.
Right? Because of the experience of being there with all the violence and all of that was going on. And that is very similar to someone being sexually assaulted. So just imagine a bomb, wondering, how is it I'm having all these flashbacks now? Or how is it that I'm having these dreams and these nightmares? Like, for example, sometimes clients will speak to, now I am 28 and I'm having these vivid dreams and I'm having these memories of, and they speak to their experiences and they're like, why all of this coming back now? I thought I was over that. And it's because it wasn't dealt with. So the dreams and the nightmares that will come, that's a symptom, that's a sign that there is some post-traumatic stress. That there's some post-traumatic stress disorder there. You have those flashbacks, or even the different personas, because the personality disorders come out of also sexual assault, where you're good one day, or you're one person now, and then when another person comes in, probably they fit the description or they remind you of your perpetrator. And so you respond in a different way, and then persons begin to say, you don't change, your mood just changed. But it's because of the experience. It's a sign, it's a symptom of post-traumatic stress. Also, persons tend to turn to drugs and alcohol to suppress those feelings. They may say, I don't know what's happening, but this brings me relief from what I'm feeling. These are all signs of post-traumatic stress. So it's important that we look out for these things, and persons can also see this in their relationships. A lot of relationships, or many relationships, let me not say a lot, but many relationships are they're preview to persons who would have been assaulted, both male and female.
Okay. This is actually making me wonder about whether or not those symptoms manifest the same way in younger people or in children. Do they? Or
in terms of after being sexually assaulted?
Yeah, because I'm also imagining a lot of, or not a lot, but conscious of how you might have well-adjusted or high-performing or average-performing students who then, things change. People develop behavioral issues, so you're always in the office now. How does it manage?
With children, you find that because children are really so innocent, they haven't really lived or experienced much. So when things do happen to them, and many times when children are sexually assaulted, they are assaulted by someone they know. Yeah. And someone who they would have trusted. So it have such an impact on them that it sends them straight into that suppressive state where they're isolated now. So a child that was once talkative and outgoing and bright and shiny is now withdrawn and very quiet. And when you reach out to touch them, they retreat to themselves very quickly, and you're wondering what's happening to you. They no longer want to be with their friends. So that sense of shame now comes on that child, because that's how they interpret it. Like, it's my fault that, you know, that person did what they did, or they're questioning themselves like, what did I do?
Yeah.
You know? Whereas for an adult now, the adult now is more conscious. So a lot more reasoning goes into what happened. So you try now to either justify the action of the perpetrator, or you try to say what you could have done. Whereas the child is more innocent, more helpless, so to say, in terms of reasoning and trying to rationalize the experience. But an adult now has that capability to, you know, decipher, well, no, you did something that was wrong, but how to deal with it moving forward, that's another conversation for the adult.
Okay. You know, when you started out talking about like the comparison or where post-traumatic stress disorder as a field comes from, you know, in terms of war, it also made me think about some of the invisibility of, or a lot of the invisibility of sexual violence or sexual assault, because I think a lot of times, you know, the vision or the image that we have in our heads is of a stranger that is really violent, physically violent, that leaves you bruised and all of those things, and not necessarily the friend who you trusted, who you just invited over for a movie, and then, you know, they assaulted you. So I was just, you know, thinking about too, like how sexual violence is often diminished in the same way that I think domestic violence is, even though people will say very clearly are like the leading types of violence that we have in our federation, but like we more so talk about the gun violence, because that is something that you can see, like you can see a gunshot wound, you can see,
and you can try to
scar.
justify the reasoning behind that action. But when there's domestic abuse, when there's sexual abuse, you can't justify it,
even though people try.
But with the gun violence, you could justify it. You could say that's retaliation, or that was a robbery, or whatever that case may be. But when it comes to sexual abuse, there's really no justification for the sexual abuse. And there's a lot of shame even around the family setting, where nobody wants to speak about the elephant that's in the room, you know, and then that is where the victim now takes on a lot of a responsibility, feeling they were responsible for that interaction. And you would find that this would have happened, or this happens a lot. And in my engagement with clients and with persons, even being a teacher for so many years and interacting with children who would have been sexually abused by a relative, or, you know, some family friend, it's alarming. It's really alarming. And then to find that children who have been sexually assaulted or abused, they tend to become promiscuous. It's like two extremes. They become hypersexuals, or they totally withdraw from society, and they become delinquents. They drop in school, their schoolwork. So you see those extremes, but then nobody wants to touch it. Because, like, how do we explain, or what would be the reasoning? But then why would a child lie? So these are things that we really have to try to address, because it's very prevalent, and we don't want to speak about it, but those are realities. You know, you speak to your daughter, you speak to your son, because even now with our little boys, we have to be very mindful of the predators that are there. But the thing is, when we say be mindful of the predators, our predators look like our mothers, our daughters, our fathers, our sons. So it's important to educate our children on what is proper touch, and let them know that regardless to what happens, I am there for you. A lot of times persons are afraid to come out. Even adults are afraid to say, this happened to me, or I went to a party. For a young adult, I went to a party and I woke up the next morning and I was assaulted. But they're afraid to say that, because then the backlash may be, well, you went to a party, you drink your rum, how you were dressed, what do you expect to happen? And so persons are afraid to come out. But that being said, then we now have another problem because the mental health challenges will now arise for that person.
Yeah.
It may affect them with how they work now, how they socialize. So whereas this person had a good 8 to 4 job, they were being productive, all of a sudden you realize productivity has dropped. They no longer can work because, and then socializing, they turn to drinking more alcohol or starting to abuse drugs. And so now we have a problem when we could have dealt with that problem.
Yeah. From a mental health.
Correct.
From a mental, and I find it's very, very interesting. I think, and I want to just take a break before because while we were preparing for this show, Andrea was talking about how much there is to talk.
Yeah, there is so much to talk about
this topic. But I mean, just the connection between productivity, the connection between people's overall well-being. I don't know if we are necessarily like proactively considering connections between people's behaviors and sexual assault or sexual violence, because for us, like, it doesn't, they don't seem related, right? It's like, okay, people expect causes and consequences to more clearly connect with each other. Correct. But I think it's really important for us to understand like the vastness and just the range,
the impact that it can have.
Of impacts that sexual assault can have on everyone. Correct. Right? And that are different among people. So we will take a break right here, and then we will come back, and you'll tell me, you did bring up how the effects of that sexual violence or sexual assault can show up in people's personal and romantic relationships. So I want you to tell me more about that. But before we do that, we'll take a short break, hear some ads, and then we'll come right back.
Okay.
Let me see what I want for Mother's Day. You know what? I think a foot spa. That would be just right. Attention all businesses. Mother's Day is just around the corner. And it is time to show appreciation for the amazing moms in our lives. At ZIZ Broadcasting Corporation, we invite you to reach out to your customers with our exclusive advertising opportunities. Capture their attention and make their Mother's Day shopping experience unforgettable. Don't miss out on this opportunity to celebrate moms and boost your sales with ZIZ. Call us at 465-2621 or visit our sales and marketing department and let us work with you to achieve your goals. ZIZ Broadcasting Corporation, connecting communities every day.
We're back, and you're listening to Pleasure Pulse, or you're watching Pleasure Pulse on ZIZ Radio, YouTube. I was gonna say TV, not TV. YouTube and Facebook. And I'm in studio with my guest Andrea Wattley, and we've been talking about the connection between sexual assault or sexual violence and mental health. So you mentioned earlier that sexual assault can sometimes, or some signs or symptoms or some of the effects of sexual assault can sometimes show up in a survivor's personal and romantic relationships. Can you tell me more about how that happens?
Okay, so for someone who would have been sexually assaulted, it means that forming intimate connections may be challenging for them. And there are a number of ways that these challenges can come up, or it can affect relationships. So I'm just going to list a few because I have about 11, 12. So I'm going to try to do half. So the first one is hypersexuality. Someone who would have been sexually abused, you find that the sexual part of it, they require way more, like sex is all they know. right? And even so, then it leads to them being not loyal, as we say, to their partner, because their partners are not able to fulfill those desires for them, and that is because of the exposure or the abuse that they would have had. So hypersexuality is one of them. The next one is difficulty trusting. So you find that someone who would have been sexually abused, they're having challenges trusting their partners. They're having those challenges being vulnerable because they would have been hurt by someone probably who they trusted, or they trusted that they wouldn't be hurt even if they didn't know the person, right? And so they have difficulty trusting their partners. The next one is the opposite of hypersexuality, where they avoid intimacy. And intimacy doesn't even necessarily just mean having sex or making love, but it leads to even opening up to your partner and forging that meaningful connection that is necessary to build a healthy relationship. So no holding of hands, no kissing, no real deep conversations. So the partner might not even be aware of the sexual abuse because they're not opening up to them about it, right? And then the next one is sexual dysfunction, where physically now, and this is a physical effect of sexual assault, where you're unable to become aroused. For the man, you're unable to become aroused. For the woman, you're unable to become aroused. Those juices are not flowing for you because of the trauma that you would have experienced. So we know that even when having sex, although it's very physical, it's very mental as well. And so the hormones that are needed, it's like there's a blockage. Those hormones don't flow the way they're supposed to flow for you because you are dealing with your trauma, right? The next one is you find sometimes that persons who would have been abused, they're often very angry, or the anger comes out of nowhere because of simple things, and the burst of anger, and that begins to affect a lot of relationships. And the partner may be wondering, where is this coming from? And it's because yes, there's a realization that I was assaulted, but there was no justice. So the anger is there because there was no justice for me. I cannot, this need to be justified. Why did it happen? And what are the repercussions for it happening to me? And then the next one that I'm going to speak to is poor boundaries. Meaning that the person who would have been assaulted is unable to establish healthy boundaries within the relationship. Either where they become codependent, they give way more than they need to give, or they take more than they're supposed to take. So the boundaries are very poor there. They're not well established to establish the right relationship. No parameters are in place. So you find that they may be more open to different things in the relationship. Some things we may say, how you could do that? But it's because, there are no real boundaries set within that relationship. So persons who would have experienced sexual assault, they sometimes even become hyper vigilant. Or they watch your every move and wonder, why did you do this? And why didn't you do this? So they're very visual as well. They're very hyper visual, vigilant as to what's happening in their spaces. So these are just some of the things that can happen within a relationship where you have a victim of sexual abuse.
Okay. And we kind of touched on this earlier, but just to speak to it more directly, the cultural and societal attitudes toward sexual assault and how they impact the psychological health of survivors, and how just that situation is compounded for people from marginalized or more vulnerable communities. And we can just start with we have a real culture of victim blaming.
Correct.
Serious rape culture. It is very, and I mean, we gave the examples why you never say something before, your story changed, I don't believe, I know this person, I don't believe they would do that, or you're sure that whatever, or why you did this, or why you didn't.
You sure you didn't do this?
Yeah. So, but you tell me more about those cultural and societal attitudes.
Okay, so we can put it in. We could probably group the persons that are being affected, right? let's say, for example, let's start with the children and come up. Children is that community of persons. You find that they are most vulnerable. And even when we see, let's say, for example, a young girl, and we would have seen her, she's promiscuous now. Let's give her age 15, and she's promiscuous. And the person say, "Oh, she always up and down the place," blah 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 blah, and nobody's gonna stop to ask why. Like,
oh, she fast.
Yeah, how did this happen? And then we go into the blaming. Oh, she parents again a boundary. She could do what she like. But sometimes and many times, children who would have been abused tend to be promiscuous because they would have been exposed to sex, right? And for them, value, they don't have a value.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, anybody could get it, because if so and so could do it, I mean, okay, I could give anybody else. And so these persons tend to feel that it doesn't even make sense to share what happened, because persons are only going to blame me. So we find that for many younger persons, or adolescents, or children, they need that safe space to come and say, "Mommy, Daddy, this happened to me," right? And be able to say who did it without parents, because sometimes parents say, "No, you're telling lie."
Yeah.
And that comes from
especially if it's sometimes the mother's
mother's partner, or sometimes too, and this is very real, where we have female predators as well, and they interfere with the children, and you'll be amazed at some of the stories, and you wonder how, like, and why. So if I'm wondering how and why, just imagine the victim, right? So that's for that set of people. Then we go to the women, and our women, society begins to say, well, how you dress, where you was, why you was there by yourself. So then you find that we play a lot of blame game, and so persons don't want to come out and say this happened to me. And because of that, persons who the violators feel like it's okay, I have a free reign to do this. And then we have our men, because men are also victims of sexual assault. Some men get raped, but they don't dare go to the police station and say, I get raped, because
then say you didn't enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's so much. I wish I had tuned into when you had the officer here. I would have loved to hear that one. But it's important to note that men suffer as well, and men also get unwanted sexual advances, and sometimes because they are men, we assume, well, it's okay, they respond to it, and I respond to it, and so they too, they need an outlet and an avenue to reach out as well. Then we have our homosexual communities as well. They too can face sexual assault, and when that does happen, then the question is, well, you mean ask for it, you know, what? So then we find that everyone within the community still have a community. They're still marginalized when it comes to sexual assault.
And then, of course, you have people with disabilities.
Oh, yeah, that one is even more of a challenge, and it's because I think here within our local setting, we don't necessarily have the resources that enable us to really help.
Let's talk about it. Let's not talk about it.
Are disabled.
Yeah.
Because then we tend to think, even us who are capable, tend to think that persons who are disabled, well, you know, like, because they are disabled, it's not as significant to someone who is fully able. And I'm like, no, we can't be like that. And they're often taken advantage of. Right. Because the perpetrators of the view, well, nobody don't take them serious. You know, so it's hard, but I think we need to be more vigilant as a people. We have to be more mindful as well of our conversations and how we view things, and be more open-minded and recognize that this is the world we're living in. We can no longer feel as though these things only happen out there, because now we're very globalized, you know, and everything that happens out there happens over here as well. Yeah. So we have to become more aware of what's happening.
Right. And part of that awareness is, and you mentioned it, before, but having conversations about good touch, bad touch.
Yeah.
But the reason that a show like this exists too is because it's been proven that comprehensive sex education helps to, address things like healthy relationships, consent, boundaries, understanding your likes and don't likes. When it comes to sex, it helps people to understand what sexual violence is and things like that. So it's like, it's not enough to only talk about sexual violence like in a vacuum. Talking about healthy sexual relationships is also important so that people know, okay, well, what is healthy or what is good and what is unhealthy, right? And then another vulnerable or marginalized, or let's say vulnerable group is like older people. And there are some stats, not from St. Kitts, coming out of older people who are in, like older people homes and stuff, and the sexual violence that happens there. So there are like lots of marginalized or smaller communities that experience higher rates of sexual violence than like the general population.
Yes, you're correct.
So,
and it's because they're more vulnerable.
And a lot of like, just what you said, the way that we engage with people who are not heterosexual, non-disabled, who are young, and just like the kind of natural marginalization that we do of folks that always predisposes people to higher levels of any kind of violence. So let's shift into, I guess, some of the supports or some of the help, because I think it's becoming like really clear that mental health support is an important part of the survivor's journey. So it's not just, the legal support, because even then, like some survivors, like that's not how they define justice, right? But it's not just the legal journey. It's not just like an acknowledgement or a recognition. It's also like the mental health support. So what are some, let's start with the individual. What are some healthy coping mechanisms that survivors can adopt to deal with
that? So the first thing I would say, after having a support system is needed for anyone who would have experienced sexual abuse or sexual assault. Will need a support system, whether it's family, whether it's friend, but they need that support. The next one would be to seek help, professional help, because there's a lot of unloading and just breaking down all the baggage from the sexual assault, and that is very important, because that is where the PTSD now comes in, where you need to be able to get to that fourth stage rather than have that whole delayed process that can take years, and it impacts your life. So it's important to get that professional help that is needed. But even before we get to that, it's important that we have those conversations about sexual health first, so that someone will know what is unhealthy. Because even within a relationship, you can be sexually assaulted by your partner in a relationship. So and you might not know that that is unhealthy behavior. So it's important to first have those conversations about sexual health, and also the support that is given around it, because sometimes we don't talk about sex. We don't talk about it at all.
We don't talk about it at all.
Right? But it's important that we educate from our children, come right up, because guess what? The TV and the internet will educate them, and they may go away with a false perception of what it really is. So then after you get the help from a therapist or a counselor, it's important that you now begin to put things in place to help you. So you begin to create healthy patterns or healthy habits. Like you take care of yourself. Self-care becomes even more important, because you have to become even more self-aware, meaning you're not focusing on the trauma anymore. You're thinking about your present and your future goals, and setting those goals actually helps that victim to move away from what happened to them. So it's not like you're ignoring what happened to you, but this is my present and this is where I want to go. So it does help them that way by setting clear guidelines for their life, creating those healthy patterns, those healthy habits, speaking to a professional, and also making sure they have that support around them.
Okay, so let's talk about that support that people need around them. What can friends, family, colleagues do to help? And I mean, I think you've mentioned some of the things that contribute to a successful recovery, but what can friends, family, intimate partners do, colleagues do? Because people, are in workplaces, they are in life around them kind of still decides to, as much as you might want it to stop, to continue. So how can that, those communities around people
I mean, speaking
support?
about someone who you know that they would have been sexually abused, or you don't know, which one?
Let's speak about both, because I think you gave some you don't want to assume, but let's speak about,
it's important to have those conversations. And the first step is not to be judgmental. I find that
you don't have to point them out and pull them aside and say, I think this happened to you.
Yeah, so
you could start by
it's important by not doing that.
Yeah.
Have those conversations about what sexual health is, good sexual health, so that it allows for the person now, even if they have been sexually assaulted, they feel freer to share and say, well, this had happened to me, so that means that should not have happened to me.
Okay.
But when we create that safe environment, then our friends, our family members are able to share.
Yeah.
And when it still goes back to us not being judgmental and bringing down that heavy hammer on anyone. Don't ask those, well, why you had to do this and why you didn't do that, because then it brings back all the guilt and the shame to that person. So we really have to create that safe space for our family members, for our friends, so that they can know, if anything happens to you, I'm here, I got your back for you, right? So that's important.
And for those who folks might know have survived a sexual assault.
So if you know someone has survived a sexual assault, it's important that you give them the grace they need, understanding that they would have gone through something that is extremely traumatic and they need the support that I can give them. If you are intimately involved, meaning we have close relationship with you, it's important that you ask the question, what can I do to help you? What do you need from me? Or is there something that you're unable to do that I can do for you? It's important to ask them, how can I help? Don't force, because sometimes as a friend, we tend to want to get them better, but at the same time recognize that this person would have been violated, and it's important that they do get that autonomy back,
right?
Because they would have lost that. They were totally vulnerable to somebody, so give them the opportunity to ask for help. So you ask them, how can I help you? Don't force help on them. So it's important that you do that.
I think that point about autonomy is so important, and I think it also does not mean that the extreme opposite should happen, where you leave them to themselves.
No, you don't do that.
Okay, I'm giving you autonomy.
I'll give you space.
Figure life out on your own. So it's finding a supportive and happy medium where even if the person is pushing back or whatever and saying they need space, that they still know that you are there. And that's also I think where grace comes in.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think with intimate partners especially, it's on this show, consent is something that we preach all the time. Consent is the foundation and center of all sexual and otherwise relationships. And especially in intimate partnerships, you might have to start to ask things that you
wouldn't usually
were like, you know, understood or whatever.
Yeah.
Because, you know, couples have
Yeah.
different ways of talking to
Yeah.
themselves, but you might have to change
Yeah,
your
correct,
language. You know, you
correct.
might have to change how you communicate
correct. Correct.
with that person.
And it's very important to have those conversations
Yeah.
with your partner too, especially if you are aware that they were sexually assaulted. It's important to have those conversations so that you know when you receive a particular response, it's not necessarily you, but it's what they would have gone through. And your role now is to how can you support them to get to this, because it's not really you, it's just what they would have been through.
That's a whole other conversation, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, this is also a side note, but you know, I was talking to a friend about, I feel like, I don't want to broad brush the Caribbean, but let's just say the Caribbean, because the Caribbean is a region birthed out of violence. And so all of us are carrying like psychological traumas, like inbuilt generational traumas, and very unhealthy ways of navigating lives, navigating life, navigating relationships, even platonic ones, even outside of sex, parental and child relationships, like intrafamilial relationships, friendships, like
There's so much navigating to do at this
we
point
just
in
struggle
time.
with all of them.
Yeah.
And so like for me, you know, as we talk about giving folks grace and understanding that, you know, it's the trauma, for me, part of the difficulty, and not necessarily with survivors of sexual violence, but it could be with survivors of sexual violence that you aren't aware happen. You know, like you're seeing things that are like you recognize them as unhealthy behaviors. So like how do you also like
deal with that?
Deal with that?
So when you say that, it's because sometimes I recognize, okay, because of my profession, and I see certain behaviors, and it lends me to think a particular way, right? Whereas somebody else looking at those behaviors will come up with
an
a whole
untrained
other, a whole
mind,
other analysis, and they're going down the line. And it's important for us to educate, and that is where the awareness is important. And I'm glad for a platform like this where we are speaking to these things, because the public really isn't aware of all of these things. It's just like, oh, we're going to brush it under the rug. It's been it ain't just start to happen, you know, and we just brush it under the rug and pray that it doesn't come back up and we move on. But no, when we look at even the media, when you see the Me Too movement, everybody's coming out, and it's not because of the time, but it's because of the era that we were in, where sexual abuse and sexual assault, and it was happening, but these persons, they were in the second stage of PTSD. So all the information, they kept it there, but now they're at a point where I'm ready to bring this to light. And that's the reality that we have. So now persons and victims of sexual assault seeing other persons, and that's a good thing too, because it does give them a little boost to say, hey, I'm not alone. This happened to somebody else, right? But here, as we speak to it locally, I think it's important that we be mindful and we open our eyes to what's happening around us, especially in our homes, with our children, with our adolescents, our young adults, even adults. You speak to the elderly. We have to be very, very mindful that these things do happen. And when somebody speak to it, don't try to go down the judging. We'll just listen. Listen to what they have to say, and then you move from there.
Okay, and final. Well, this is not my final question, because I know you wanted to talk about some things, but like the example that I gave, would you say it's important to ask questions then? Like if you are observing or experiencing certain types of unhealthy behavior, like somebody, you know, like raising their voice at you, or someone ignoring you, or just what they call stonewalling. Like,
okay, so within those parameters, it's okay for you to ask, is everything okay? Do you want to talk about what's happening? And we try to create that environment where persons feel free to talk. And if they don't feel free to talk to you, you say, would you like to speak to someone? I know so first do your research to see if there's somebody else who could probably help you you.
Yeah.
If you already have that train of thought that, my partner needs help, if I can't help, who can help them? Because it doesn't make sense to create an awareness and then there's no help for them, because then it only increases their sense of helplessness, right? So it's always important to try to do that research so that persons can know what they can do to get help.
Yeah, thank you. And last week's show and the week before, guest here mentioned that, once you go through once you go to the police or you contact gender affairs, if you're a survivor of sexual assault and you're seeking help, they will, I think, also refer you to the counseling unit.
Correct.
So that
To
is,
get therapy.
yeah, that is a resource.
And that is very good.
Professional help, yeah.
It's
that
really
exists.
important that they get that professional help. Really, really important, because sexual trauma is so far-reaching. It doesn't just affect the person, it affects those around the person as well. So it's important that we tackle it. Once we are aware, we try to tackle it and provide the support to the person, to the victims.
Yeah. And you wanted to share some events
Yeah,
or
so
some support services.
Next month is Mental Health Awareness Month, the month of May. So for the entire month, we'll be doing a lot of awareness when it comes to mental health, recognizing the importance of creating awareness now. Because mental health is connected to all aspects of our life, connected to money, our spiritual life, our sexual life, everything, right, as it relates to mental health. And so 3C's counseling services for the month of May will be doing something. So every Saturday, we'll be providing free mental health diagnostic screenings for depression, postpartum, the different diagnostic tests that are available. So if anybody, you're wondering if you're depressed and you want to be screened for depression, you can just visit us or give me a call to let me know, hey, I would like to do the free screening. That will be available every Saturday for the month of May. And then on the 20th, I must speak to the initiative that Development Bank will be doing, which is a mental health walk that will be on Saturday the 25th of May. So we've gone ahead and we've partnered with Development Bank to host this walk where we're encouraging persons to turn out to the walk. The theme for this year's mental health is movement for our mental health. That's the theme. So that's where the walk came from. So persons who are interested in participating in this walk, you're encouraged to come on out. You can participate in the walk for free, but you can also purchase packages of $40 and $65 packages. The monies that are raised will be used to sponsor a student who is currently studying psychology. So we're trying our best to create the necessary resources so that we can get more personnel on the island who are equipped with the psychological skills to help persons. So you can purchase the package via the JAD app, and they're $40 and they're $65. So we're encouraging persons to do that. So that's on the 25th of May. So every Saturday we're doing free diagnostic testing for mental health screening. And then on the 25th, there'll be a mental health walk. And then on the 26th, we'll be having a mental health seminar. It's titled Her Response. And the host will be yours truly, where we'll be speaking to a number of areas as it relates to mental health and the importance of movement. And movement doesn't just necessarily mean the physical movement. So it's going to be an interesting time that Sunday afternoon from 4:30. So you're going to be seeing the flyers out there. The walk is already out there. You're going to be seeing the information out there for you to actively participate in creating that awareness. And then on the 29th of May, we'll be having a free movie titled A Beautiful Mind. I don't know, many persons have seen it. It's an old movie, but it's a very good movie. I'm not going to tell you about the movie because I need for you to show up. It's going to be at the Green Valley Pub on the 29th, and it's a free movie. So you don't have to pay. You just come and enjoy the screening, okay? So I want to encourage those of you who are listening to me to support the different initiatives Other partners have come on board, such as First Federal Bank has come on board, SAL has come on board, and a number of corporate entities are coming on board to help create that awareness during Mental Health Month. So I'm super excited about this month coming
I
up.
love that. And of course, you'll be back for us to have another conversation on mental health and sex in May. Yes. So I look forward to that.
Correct.
As well. Thank you so much. Do you have any final words? Or?
So I just want to say the topic for
and
tonight.
give people your number so they can reach you about the.
So I just wanted to
screening.
say the persons who are listening and you would have been a victim of sexual abuse or sexual assault, I want you to know that it was not your fault. That's the first thing. I want you to know that there's help out there for you. And we are here to provide the support that you need. You need support in a confidential and a safe space. And so if you're that person, you can reach out to me at 668-0101 so that we can have the conversation that you would like to have and get the support that you need. If you're interested in the activities for the month of May, I encourage you to reach out as well. You can call me at 668-0101. There's a WhatsApp attached to that number as well that you can reach out to me by, or via Facebook or Instagram. And you can also even reach out to me via TikTok. Our TikTok name is Second Chances. So we are here for you. So I want you to know that mental health is on the rise in our Twin Island Federation. So I'm happy for that.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for joining again for another, this conversation on the connection between sexual assault and mental health. And thank you to all of my listeners for staying with us, joining us and staying with us this evening. As usual, Pleasure Pulse is a safe, inclusive space for everybody where no topic is too big or too small. And it was my pleasure to have you this evening, and I hope you have a good night. Bye.
Bye.